Welcome to part 2 of Practical Carping. The kettle's on, the rods are out and the baits are in position. In part 2 of this video I'm going to take you through carp rigs in their entirety. I'm going to show you some basic rigs, some basic presentations, and I can ensure you that they'll catch carp on your waters today. I'm also going to take you through how I approach your water, what goes through my mind as I'm driving along here in the car, and what makes me choose the swim. I'm going to show you the features that are attractive to carp and why you should look for those features in your lake. And finally, I'm going to show you how I set up my tackle, how I point the rods, what angles they're at, why they're pointed downwards, and why I use swingers and not monkey climbers. Hope you find it all instructive. The first aspect of the carp fishing that we'll cover is the aspect of carp rigs. And the best place to look at these is in the home. Now, carp rigs, now that's a subject which has got people endlessly confused over the years. So much has been written about it. If you thought that carp baits was confused, then you can find that when you're thinking about carp rigs, you can even be more confused. One thing I would say before we actually start to look at carp rigs is it's important to make sure that your bait is as good as you can get it. Because if you can get those carp to eat that bait with confidence, you can catch them on almost anything. The last thing you want to do is fish with a bait which the carp can take or leave. So always make sure the bait is as attractive as possible, and the rig to a certain extent will take care of itself. I've got in front of me here today quite a few books written on rigs. Now these are actually specific rig books. As well as this, there are columns each month, there are whole chapters devoted in books, and the worst thing is it gets more complicated each and every year. Well, don't worry, I'm not going to confuse you in this segment. I'm going to give you some sound advice. I'm going to show you some sound presentations and end tackles which help you catch fish, and I can assure you that if you copy these and use them properly, you will definitely catch fish. So what do we mean when we talk of the term carp rig? People glibly talk about carp rigs as though it could be anything. Are they talking about the lead? Are they talking about the tubing? The hook? The hair? Or what? There are so many different pieces that you have in your tackle box, and there's so many different pieces that go to make a carp rig. What we're going to do is cover two main areas, the end tackle and the presentation. The first part of the carp rig that I want to discuss is the part known as the end tackle. And the end tackle is the lead, the beads, the swivel and the anti-tangle tubing if you wish to use it. That is your end tackle. The presentation would be your hook length that came off there. There are two types of end tackle that are normally used. There's a helicopter rig here and there's the inline rig here. To start with, we'll look at the helicopter rig. This is this one here. The helicopter rig is so called because it's at one end is your lead and there's a swivel here which can go around in a circle, giving the helicopter effect. This is what you would use on a gravel pit. If you think about this, when you're casting out, your lead goes first, your swivel's here and your hook link's off here. That will hit the gravel, but your swivel and your hook link will be protected, and this is commonly used in gravel pits. It does have one deficiency in that when it's actually used in weed, there is a problem in that if the carp gets stuck in the weed, the carp is pulling on here and you are pulling on here, so you have two forces not pulling together, and that can give you all sorts of problems. You often will end up pulling at a carp that you think is directly in front of you, and actually it is 10 or 15 yards to the right of you. So with a helicopter rig, or an end-on bomb rig as some people call it, only use that in clear waters, in silt waters or in gravel pits. The second of our rigs is what is known as an inline rig, and it's known as an inline rig because the line goes straight from the angler straight through to the swivel, in line. As you can see there, you've got the lead, the anti-tangle tubing and the swivel there. The angler has a direct pull from one end to the fish. This is the kind of setup that you would use for fishing in weed. So those are the two setups. The first end tackle that I'm going to describe how to use and how to make up is the one that we call the helicopter rig. As you can see, this is the one that's made up. You can actually buy them like this already made up, and you just need to purchase a bomb to add on, or you can make them up yourself. And if you want to make them up yourself, it's simplicity. First of all, you cut your piece of anti-tangle tubing to the length that you desire. Usually it's 12 to 16 inches, but you can have it less or longer as long as your hook length is not longer than the length of your anti-tangle tubing. Next, get your bead, push it over the tubing as so. Now sometimes you will have a problem getting your bead over the tubing. If you do have that problem, all you need to do is chop the end of the tubing down. It's a nice firm fit, but it will come off. Again, swivel and your final bead. These beads are made by Kevin Nash, but you can actually get beads made by Terry Eustace, Zen and Bodgeco's Rig Connection and Drennan. They're all good beads. So there you have the initial part. You then get your piece of link tubing, and that just pushes on the end like that. Dead easy. To secure this, if you want to make sure it's firmly fixed, then you can use a bit of the rig glue. You don't actually have to use specific rig glue, but the gardener glue is as good as any that I've seen. Just put a little blob just on the end of there, and that will keep the main tubing and the link tubing together. You then thread your line through your anti-tangle tubing, right through there, and it will come out this end. You tie the line to here, and then you draw them together as so. Push the link tubing over that. Nice firm fit so it doesn't come off. Push your beads down a little bit further, and there you have the complete helicopter rig. The second of the end tackles that I'm going to look at is the one that I've called the inline rig. Again, if you look there, you can see that's a standard inline rig, 3-ounce coated bomb, length of anti-tangle tubing, and the swivel to which you add your hook link. This is even easier to make than the helicopter rig. All you do is push the tubing into there. Again, it should fit nicely. You thread your line through the anti-tangle tubing. That will take it through the centre of the bomb, will come out this end. You tie the line to the swivel. You push your swivel into there, and there you have a standard inline rig. Now I know that you'll be wondering, well, how on earth do I get a bomb like that, and how on earth do I thread anti-tangle tubing, because I've had problems with them. Well, I'll explain those 2 points now. Now the problem is that you have to thread this fine line, which can be anything between 8 and 15 pounds, through what is in effect a fine bore tubing. And I have tried countless ways to do this, but I've come up with one fail-safe way. There are a few certain things that you have to start with. A, your line must be nice and clean. Now for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just using a spare spool. Obviously normally your line would be through your rings and straight down. You must make sure that the line is nice and smooth. If it is crinkled, wrinkly, covered in fish oils or grime or otherwise, then it will not thread through your tubing. Secondly, the tubing that we're using is Terry Eustace's 0.5mm tubing. This is a tubing that is used a heck of a lot and is always referred to in articles. Again, you must make sure that this tubing is brand new and does not have any grime or muck in it, because if there is any muck at all in this tubing, you will not be able to push your fine line through the tubing, as the grit will stop its process. First of all, decide how long you want your tubing to be. Again, 12 to 15 inches is a good idea. Trim off the tubing. Don't bite it off or anything like that, because you want both ends of the tubing to be able to facilitate the line going through it. Next, take hold of the tubing and slightly stretch it. That stretching process will make sure that there are no kinks in the tubing. Next, get your line, making sure it's nice and smooth, and just trim the end off. Just trim slightly at an angle so you get somewhat of a point on it. Take your tubing, push it into there, and push it down. And as you can see, the tubing is clean, the line is smooth, there are no kinks or bends in the tubing, and any time now I would expect the line to come out through the end of the tubing like so. Very, very easy. It's a problem that a lot of people have, but it's that easy. And whether you're threading £10 line through or £20 line through, and whether your tubing is 10 inches long or 30 inches long, it's just as easy. Clean tubing, clean line, and a nice diagonal cut. As you've seen in this part of the rig sequence, all the presentations and all the end tackles that I've shown have been the coated leads like this. And you're probably wondering, well, why doesn't he use the standard coloured leads like this? Because that's what you get in tackle shops normally. Well, it's actually quite simple. As far as I'm concerned, carp learn by association, and when they've been caught a number of times, be it on a bait, an end tackle or a presentation, they will start to learn. And if you've ever actually seen a lead drop through the water, it goes through the water like that, it hits the floor, and your hook link naturally follows it down as so, and will almost inevitably end up next to your lead. Now, when the carp haven't been caught very many times, this won't make a difference, but after the carp have been caught a number of times, eventually you will have a lead like that with a hook next to it like that, and eventually the carp will start to scare off that. What you need to do is make your end tackle as subtle or as camouflaged as possible. And so I try always, no matter where I'm fishing, to camouflage my lead, be it green or brown or mottled, to match the lake bed exactly. Sometimes I'm fishing in weed, sometimes I'm fishing in silt, and sometimes I'm fishing in mud. So I obviously pick a colour that matches the lake bed. It might not catch you many extra carp a year, but even if it only catches you one or two of the cutest carp or the wary carp, and they're often the big ones, it's worth persevering with. So how do you go from that standard lead, as it appears in most tackle shops, to that lead there, which is a kind of lead, the kind of end tackle that I would ask you to use in your presentations? Well, it's actually quite easy. You can actually coat leads by using something that Terry Eustace and quite a few other tackle dealers have, and that's called the lead coating paint. This is quite an easy process, but it's one I've yet to get right. You heat your lead up as much as possible, and when it's heated up, you add the lead coating to it, and then that sets over it, giving it a lovely mottled effect. Well, unfortunately, I've tried this time and time and time again, and all I end up doing is melting the lead and ending up with a real mess. So I myself have come up with a special way that is far better, with its simplicity itself. All you need to do is paint your leads to match the colour of the lake bed. The paint itself is available from any model shop, certainly Woolworths sell them, so you have 2 tins of paint there. Paintbrush, a file, some of Kryston Hawser, a Stanley knife, and a bit of Drennan's elastic. This is a catapult elastic. The first thing you know is that on the lead that you get from the tackle shop, it's got tubing coming out of both ends. Well, you don't need tubing on both ends, you only need tubing on one end. So all we need to do is purely and simply cut that off. Just be careful when you're cutting here, because these Stanley knife blades are very, very sharp, and you may end up breaking them on your fingers. Snap it off like that, and taking your nail file, just smooth it like that. That just takes the rough edges off it. So then you have the first part of the bomb. Next, using your Drennan feeder pult elastic, just cut the end off, and I've started, it's quite hard to cut through here. Always take great care when using a Stanley knife blade that you do cut onto a nice firm surface so that you don't cut yourself. That bit there, push on the end of there, nice secure fit. Now you'll have to hold the lead like that and push on nice and tightly. So in effect you've ended up with that. That's your first part of your rig. Then take your paints, give them a good shake, and then paint them to match the colour of your lake bed. Sometimes you'll be fishing on weed, sometimes in silt, and sometimes on gravel. So pick a colour that matches your lake bed. It doesn't have to be exact, A mottled effect like that is great. 2 or 3 coats of that and it's spot on. When you've coated it, you'll end up with a lead like that. Very blue Petrish, I know, but that's the lead I presented earlier. Then, using a substance known as Kryston Hawser, which is actually known as a permanent stiffener. It's sort of a resin which is a cross between super glue and varnish. And as you can see there, just bubbles out. And what you need to do is just pour just a little bit on the lead. Make sure it doesn't leak over everywhere. And just smooth it with your hand like that. Now you're probably wondering why on earth am I doing that when in fact the lead already matched the colour of the lake bottom. Well, unfortunately paint on its own doesn't have much abrasion resistance, and if you cast out your lead 2 or 3 times then the paint would scrape off, and that's not a particularly good idea because you'll have to paint your leads 2 or 3 times. Coating it with this Kryston Hawser substance actually puts a varnish on them, and if you give them probably 2 or 3 coats over a day or so, let them dry 24 hours, then that will go absolutely rock solid as with that, and you can cast that onto gravel all day and the colour is exactly the same week in, week out, and that's as good as any angler in the country could make, and that's ideal for you. The second aspect of carp rigs is the area known as presentation. If you remember earlier, the end tackle is the lead, the anti-tangle tubing and the mainline. The presentation itself is your hook, your hair, your boilie and your braid. So that is your presentation. Now I could confuse everybody by telling you 20 or 30 or even more than that different kinds of presentation that will catch carp. But this video isn't aimed at confusing you, it's aimed at being practical. So what I will do is I'll show you the certain products and why I use them, and then I will show you 5 simple presentations that will catch carp on most waters today. Now there are certain elements that appear in all presentations. Firstly, there is the hook. All carp presentations, no matter what they are, entail the use of a hook. Now just like boilies, just like floats and just like cars, everyone's got their own favourite carp hook. I tend to use 2 kinds of carp hooks. One is the Partridge Z2 record breaker hooks, and the second one are the Drennan Super Specimens. If I'm using a small boilie, say a 14mm or a 16mm or something of that size, then I will use the Drennan Super Specimen hooks. If I'm using a bigger bait, or if I'm using a double boilie, I'll use the Partridge Z2 hooks. These Z2 hooks have a slightly wider gape to them and they're better for hooking, but really if you just kept to those 2 hooks for the rest of your carp fishing, you wouldn't have any problems at all. Obviously if you're fishing into areas of heavy weed and to snags and winter fishing, you may need a specialist kind of hook, but that's something we can cover later. Second part of the presentation that all presentations entail is the use of some kind of hook link. Now there are various types of hook links available, but I tend to use for most of my fishing, certainly 95%, Kryston's Merlin. Now Merlin, aptly named because it weaves magic so-called on the fish, is available in a number of sizes, but the sizes that are appropriate to most fishing today are 12, 15 and 25 pounds. And as you can see, this is a mottled green effect, and because the waters that I fish are weedy waters or brown waters or dark coloured waters, this kind of braid is ideal. It's supple and it can fool the carp into picking up the bait. The third aspect that all rigs entail, certainly now today's rigs entail, is the use of a hair rig. And whether you're looping and tying on a bait or whether you're using a standard hair, all carp rigs of today use one form of hair rig or another. And I'll show you how I tie a typical hair rig up. Now the hair rig, so aptly named because it was fine line, I think it was originally a hair, enables you to present a bait off the hook. Before the hair rig, baits were presented on the hook, and when the carp sucked the bait into its mouth and blew it out, because the bait was connected to the hook and was rigid to it, they both went out together. By using a hair rig, the carp couldn't feel the hook, and when the bait was blown out, the hook would catch in the carp's mouth and so self-hook. So the hair rig is a very big advantage to carp fishing. Now you can make the hair rig out of all forms of braids and nylons or whatever. Some people prefer to use a pound line, some people prefer to use a continuation of the braid, but my favourite is the dental floss. Now when you first look at dental floss, you feel it in your hands and it feels quite thick, and you think, well, wouldn't it be better to use a fine nylon line? Well, the advantages of dental floss are that although it feels thick in your hands now, when immersed in the water will get between the strands, open the strands out, and it is far more likely to enable the carp to self-hook itself because it folds back on itself. Dental floss, when wet, just folds back on itself better than nylon, which has an inherent springiness to it and doesn't fold back as easily. So I always use unwaxed dental floss. You can get this from any major pharmaceutical company like Boots or wherever. And to tie a hair rig up, first of all, it's very, very easy indeed. Just form a loop like that. Get the spare end once through, twice through. As easy as that. Slide it down, and that's your hair. And then slide that down to the appropriate sized hole. Draw tight. Now that's the loop which is going to enable you to put the boilie stop. Now usually I just add a little bit of super glue to there to make sure that doesn't slip. When you've done that, neatly trim it off as so. Carefully removing any little bits of hair around. That in itself is going to be the hair. Again, trim off as so.
How far?
Trim the hair off approximately 3 or 4 inches. You're not actually going to use a 3 or 4 inch hair, but you want some excess to tie to the eye of your hook. You take your baiting needle and your boilie. Baiting needle goes straight through the boilie, as so. On the loop, push through and pull through like that. That is your boilie mounted on the hair. Take a little stop. Now these are the Drennan boilie stops, but they're also made by people like Kevin Nash and Ivel Tackle. Put that in the loop there, draw tight, and that is your boilie on a hair. Having mounted our boilie on the hair, the next thing that we need to do, and it's a thing that is common to all carp rigs, carp presentations, is to tie your hook to your braid. Very, very simple this. I've seen all sorts of knots explained in the press, but the one that I've had the most joy with is a simple Grinner knot. Very, very easy this. Through once, and then through again. If you have problems with it going through twice, just wet it as I did then and just pull through like that. Very, very easy. You've got it through twice there. Hold it in your hands, the point like that, then form a loop as so. Small loop, again, wet that, and then through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Draw together, nice and smoothly as so. Don't pull it too tight. Now wet it, line it all up and draw it together gently. As you can see, it's drawn together on the eye. Before you pull it really tight, just wet it a little bit more and then pull tight as so. And that is a Grinner knot. That is a very, very good knot, and that's the knot that I would use with braids all the time. Having tied the hook and the braid together and trimmed off the excess braid, we now need to mount the boilie on the hook. Now I'm going to show you 5 presentations that entail various forms of mounting, but one thing they all have in common is that the boilie is always used on a hair. First of all, just thread your hair through like that. Just hang the boilie so the bottom of it is just, or the top of it is just touching the bottom of the hook, as so. Then holding it so it doesn't slip, thread it through once more. Again, you may need to wet it to get it through. As you can see, through, and then a simple granny knot, through once and through again. Pull tight and then trim the dental floss off like so. And you'll be left with a boilie hanging like that. Now if for some reason your boilie has slipped and is too far down, or has slipped and is too far up, don't just leave it and hope it's okay. Take it off and redo it. Then choose how long a hook length you want. Usually 12 to 16 inches will be okay. And again, just trim off like that. Now obviously we want the hair to be retained against the hook shank at the right point. So what we do is we use a product that we know as shrink tube. Now there's various degrees of shrink tube available. There is 1mm, 2mm and 3mm. I use the used to shrink tube because this is probably one of the better ones, and you don't actually need to use naked heat. You can use hot water or you can use steam from a kettle. Just get your shrink tube and cut off the appropriate amount of tube, which is usually probably in the region of 1 centimetre to 1.25 centimetres. Just cut it off as so. Then take the end of your braid, wet it through the tubing and slide it down like that. Push it over that, over the knot and down, and that should be in direct line with the hook point. And that is how it should hang. And that is a perfect hair rig bottom bait. And all you need to do now is take that, put it under a little bit of steam or in hot water, and it will shrink down and it will be a perfect tight fit, and no matter how hard you cast, it won't come off. As I said earlier, there's various types of presentation that will catch carp, and I could certainly detail now 20 or 30 different ones that you could use. But rather than do that and boring you and overcomplicating the issue, I will detail 5 that are probably applicable to your kind of fishing. We'll start with a very basic one that I've just showed you how to tie up, and that's the standard bottom bait. Remember a moment ago I showed you how to tie this up. 12 to 15 inches of braid, a hook, boilie and a dental floss hair. Again, look how that sights. The boilie, top of the boilie is just touching the bottom of the hook. That is perfect. You can obviously vary different things. You can make the boilie bigger and smaller, the hair longer and shorter, and the braid longer and shorter. You would use a standard bottom bait like this where it isn't too weedy and where it's nice and silty or a clean bottom. Again, this is a standard presentation that will catch carp in most waters. Second form of presentation is the double bottom bait. And rather than one single bait, we're actually using 2 baits on our hair here. Again, tie it up as before, put your single boilie on and follow it through with a second boilie. Again, because it's a bit more of a mouthful, I don't like the boilies to be too low down. So this one is touching the back of the shank. Again, a bigger hook this time, shrink tubing, and we've got the braid here. Probably a shorter hook length would work here, 8 to 10 inches, and this would work ideal on clean bottoms in silty waters where it's not too weedy. A third type of presentation is the rig that we call the pop-up rig. Now, if you're fishing a standard bottom bait and you're fishing in weed, then sometimes your boilie can get stuck in the weed on the bottom of the lake. To avoid that, you use a pop-up boilie so it hangs in the water like that. And the good thing about this is that you can actually fish it any distance above. I've set that about 1 inch. And you can have it 6 inches, 1/4 of an inch, or however deep you wish to set it. Very, very easy. Use exactly the same hook length as a standard bottom bait, and all that you're doing is using a pop-up, which is a buoyant bait, and using a split shot to hold it down at the required depth. And that puts that bait on view to the carp, very easy for the carp to find. And that's your standard pop-up. When I talked about pop-ups a moment ago, I was talking about holding them down from the bottom with a split shot or putty. Well, the putty that I use all the time is a putty made by Kryston, and it's called the Heavy Metal putty, and it's available in various colours. There's the standard grey one, and then if you think it really matters, which I do, you can match it up to the lake bed. You've got a brown one there and a green one there. And what you do is you can fish it in one of two ways. You can either critically balance it or overshot it. Now those are two complicated terms and I'll briefly explain them. What critically balancing means is you add just enough putty so that when the putty's on, it just slowly sinks it down to the bottom like that. The carp comes along, it sucks at the bait because it can see it or smell it, and because it's critically balanced, it will fly into the carp's mouth very easily, and that is what is called critically balancing. It's a shot with just enough putty moulded round it to hold it down. Now sometimes when the carp have been caught time and time and time again on critically balanced baits, they will suck from a little bit of a distance away and they will become wary of hook baits which fly up and towards them. So one way around this is to overbalance your pop-ups. Again, you're using the same pop-up presentation, but instead of just using enough putty to hold it down, you add more putty on so it's overbalanced, so that in an initial suck it wouldn't move at all. But with even more of a suck, or when the carp's confident with it, boom, into the carp's mouth. So that's the two ways of using it, either critically balanced where there's just enough to sink it down, or overshotted where the carp are becoming more wary of critically balanced baits. Both of these work very well indeed. And the final presentation, again, is a pop-up presentation, as you can see here. On a first examination, you're probably thinking it's exactly the same as the other presentations. It's a standard pop-up and it's either critically balanced or overshotted. But what we've done here is we've coated the last 1.5 inches in Hawser. Again, that's the rigid stiffener by Kryston. You don't actually need to use this, you can actually use super glue. And the reason why we do this is for one of two reasons. Firstly, when carp have been caught time and time on pop-up presentations, they do get a little bit wary of them. They will suck the presentation in, and because the braid is so supple, what gets sucked in easily can also get blown out easily. So to improve that presentation, you coat the last 1.5 inches in this super glue. The carp sucks the presentation in, and because it's stiff and can't crumple up like a normal braid, the carp tries to blow it out and it catches in its mouth. See the difference there? That's a stiffness, and that's a supple braid. That can easily be blown out, whereas that which is stiff can't be blown out half as easy. And that's a very, very good way of making a pop-up even more effective. 1.5 inches of residence there. You can actually enlarge that to 3 inches or 4 inches, but I found about 1.5 inches is enough to fool any carp. And with a pop-up bait, you want it to be suspended above the bottom. And if this takes in water, it won't be suspended above the bottom, it will sink down. The problem with this, of course, is that you've pierced the bait. That piercing with a boilie needle will cause water to go in it, so we can't use the same process that we use for that. So what we've devised is a way known as the loop system. And it's simplicity itself, although many people worried about it. First of all, form a loop, just like tying a grinner knot. As such, and through 3 or 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Draw tight, as so. Again, that's the same knot that you use to tie your braid. Now start to slide it down until you get a reasonable sized hole available, that loop. Put your boilie in the loop, as so, and start to draw it round it. Just like that. As you can see, it's got to form right the way around it. Draw that tight and tighter and tighter. Eventually it will bind onto it as so. Now before you pull it rock tight, you've got to line it up properly. There we go. As you can see, that's lined up completely the way around it. Grab hold of both ends of it and pull tight. Now that's as tight as I can make it. Because that's a loop and it's a Grinner knot loop, it cannot untighten. All it can do is tighten up. And you take your Stanley knife, you cut the end off that, and that is a standard looped pop-up. Now, although braids are a very good way of catching carp and they're very supple, they can be taken into the carp's mouth very easily, they do have a problem in that they have a natural buoyancy to them. And if you've ever watched a braid go through the water, it will go like so, it will come down, and the braid above it will follow like that. And when you're using a long hook length of more than 6 or 7 inches, there will be a loop contained which will stay like that, and it doesn't lie flat because it's buoyant. Now, most waters that won't matter a one jot. Certainly in the dark the carp will never see it. But if the carp can see that loop, eventually they become wise of it, and certainly on clear waters or waters where they're fouling it with the fins, it will spook them and you won't get the chances that you should do. So how do we take the buoyancy out of this? Well, there are 2 or 3 very easy methods. The first one is the most basic, and it just means taking a bit of dirt, any old rubbish from the lake bed, and just pull it up and down your braid. Now what this will do, although it's very difficult to tell, bits of the muck will embed themselves on the braid and that will actually sink the braid down, and that's the very easiest way of doing it. The second way is by using one of the purpose-made substances, and this is one of Dave Chilton's Kryston products, and again this is a substance called magma. Again, a similar tube to Hawser, but it's a completely different substance. What magma is it's a liquid weight, and this liquid weight you just squeeze a little bit on where you think your loop may come up, and we'll say probably 4 or 5 inches down. Just like that. And all you need to do is just turn it round like that. And as you can see, a little bit of magma has formed on that. And although that doesn't appear to be much, it's certainly enough to take the loop out of it. And what you have to do is give that about 20 to 40 seconds to dry, depending on how warm or how cold it is. And when that has dried, you just take it in your fingers and roll it, just as you were making a sausage, and that will flatten it down. And when you cast out, that boilie will come through the water, and the magma loop will just sink down like that, because there's only a little bit of weight, but because it's tungsten weight, very heavy, it'll take the loop out of it, and that's less likely to scare the carp. A product that most of you will have heard about is a product that we call PVA. Now it's got a longer name than that, but I think we can stick by calling it PVA. And what PVA does is when it's immersed in water, it will melt, which is very useful where we want to put boilies out into the lake bed and then separate them from the hook bait. So what we have here is a standard hook bait. There is the attraction of one boilie only. So how do we make that 4, 5 or 6 times more attractive? Well, what we do is we use those 6 baits on a PVA stringer. Very easy to use. First of all, just push the boilies on the boilie needle. You don't actually need to use a 6 bait stringer, and for the purposes of this I'll just concentrate on a 3 bait stringer. I've used as many as 10 baits on a stringer, and I've used as little as 2 baits. You've got the 2 baits on the stringer, and now using the Kryston Meltdown. Now there's been various PVAs available over the years, but what a PVA must do, once it's cast out, it must take the force of the cast, but secondly, when immersed in the water, it must disperse from the actual hook bait, because if it's attached to the hook bait, then the carp will have problems taking it all in. So this is the only PVA I've ever used that actually does disperse when it's supposed to do. So take your stringer needle, hook the PVA around it, and push the boilies on, almost like threading that bottom bait on a hair. And as you'll see, the PVA comes out like that. So take it up and just bite it off clear, as so. So what you have there is a 3 bait PVA stringer. There's a little loop there, and all you do is put your hook point through there, just tighten it up to it, not too tight, and there you have a 3 bait PVA stringer. And if you notice, I've left a little gap between the hook and the first boilie in each of the boilies. For PVA to work properly, it needs to have some PVA where the water can hit it. If you pull that up tight, there's no PVA for the water to attack. The water must have something to attack, and giving them a gap there, a gap there and a gap there, the water can get in, and when it melts, what will happen is that will be laid there and 3 separate baits will be there. The carp will swim along, it'll smell the attraction of 4 baits, it'll suck these in, and yet only one will have the hook on. It's a very, very good way of catching carp, that. While there's nothing wrong with thinking in advance about where you intend to fish, you really should leave your decision until you get to the water. Although I like to have some idea about where I like to fish, I always wait till I actually get and see the water before I make that decision. If you've done some work in advance, and I'd advise you to visit the water a couple of times, then you may have had chance to produce a map like this. Obviously this is a fully detailed map. Any map that you can obtain, be it a visual drawing or one with depths on, is a big advantage. Although this is the noisiest side of the lake, it's also a good area to fish for the carp, with areas of shallows here bordered by deep water and visible snags, weed and lilies on each side. Even though the water is only 1 to 2 foot deep, the carp will move through here and feed on the natural food items deposited on the shallows. Carp love warm water, so place your baits on there. Another good place to find carp is in bays. This is a typical bay that you'd find on many waters. Small, tucked away to one side, and full of features, weed, lily pads, and best of all, nice and quiet. All day long you'll find carp nestling in here, summer and winter. So always look for a place like this. Carp love islands as well. You'll actually find that they circle the islands day and night. And if you can cast a bait tight against an island, as long as it doesn't fall too far away from the island, it's a great place to locate carp. Lily pads are an excellent carp holding feature. In the heat of the day, you'll find the carp nosing in and out of these lily pads and the suckers for a floater, whereas at night, if you fish on the outside of the pads, you can pick them up with boilies and standard particles. A natural haven for food, wherever you find weed, you'll find carp. Full of natural food, and the carp will root in there day and night, winter and summer. Brilliant place to catch them from. Carp respond to pressure, and if too much pressure is in one area, they'll move to a quiet area. Look for areas of undisturbed water, free from anglers' lines. Great place to find carp. With anglers fishing at 50 to 100 yards on most waters, never forget the margins. These are excellent places to fish in. As you can see, weed on either side, plenty of natural cover for the carp and warmer water. As well as visible features, never underestimate the effect of temperature and the weather. Just a little bit of wind here pushing into the swim, and this is enough to push carp into this area. A strong wind would have them feeding like crazy. Warm weather will push them onto the top of the bars, cold weather off the bars. The temperature has a huge influence on your choice of location. You don't have to be Superman, but a beautiful body helps. You have to make sure that you are actually fishing the water in front of you and that you're not fishing the water to either side of you. As you can see, I've set my delkins and my rear buzzer bars so that the rod is pointed low and towards the water surface. You'll see that many setups have the rods pointed high, pointing up in the air. Now this is obviously useful when you're fishing over weed and close in gravel bars. I'm not fishing over any weed or any gravel bars, so I want my rods pointed low, the line's in direct line with the baited end tackle, and the carp are not going to spook into it. I want as much line as possible laid along the lake's bed. As you can see, I've already got 2 rods cast out, and I'm now going to show you how I put my rods out. As soon as you cast out, let the lead sink through the water on a slack line. Just it gets near the bottom of the water, just put your finger on the spool and you'll actually feel the lead thump the bottom. If you don't feel anything at all, then it's probably dropped in weed. If you feel it thump the bottom, then it has dropped on a nice clear spot, which is what we're looking for. Then take up the slack of the line by using the reel as so. It's very important not to move the lead at this stage. Put your rod in the rear rod rest and over the front buzzer. Always make sure that your line is resting across the sensor head. Next, undo your clutch, as so, and tighten up by hand. Once you can feel that this is very, very tight, you're as tight to the lead as you want to be. Clip on your swinger, as so, and as you'll see the swinger is up at the top. That is because the line is very tight. Now start paying line off gently from the front of the reel, as so. Leave your swinger so that it can rise upwards for a take or drop downwards for a drop back. That is actually set perfect. Make sure that your clutch is just set sufficiently for a take, or engage your bait run if you wish to fish like that. If possible, try and make sure all your reel handles are lined up so you know exactly where they are in the dark. Check all your swingers are hanging perfectly. Make sure your buzzers are switched on. And clearly there you can hear the difference between each of the tones, and you're now fishing. As you can see, I've laid a rod mat underneath my rod, my reels and my swingers. At the moment it's not raining and the ground is quite clean, but when it rains, mud will splash up, it'll get into your reels, into your swingers and into your buzzers. That can affect a gentle take, so a little mat like this will stop all that happening. As soon as you've got your rods out, then make sure you've got your unhooking mat ready, your scales and your weigh bag. It may take 2 hours, it may take 20 minutes for you to catch your first fish, and you don't want to have to be rooting about in your tackle bag to find your unhooking mat. Also, make sure that you've got your landing net ready as well. There is no point at all in casting out without that landing net being set up. Sometimes I've had a take within seconds of casting out, and if you've not got your landing net set up, you're going to have real problems. Remember what I said earlier about bait application. Don't think that you've found a good spot and can afford to pile in thousands of baits. You've found the spot to put your rods in, trickle your bait in nice and slowly. 20 to 50 baits round each baited end tackle is sufficient. You really don't need to fire in thousands of baits at all. Remember the old saying, you can always add more baits, but you can't subtract them. Always sit as close as possible to your rods and watch the water. I know it's very convenient to go down to your mate and have a cup of tea with him and have a chat with him. If he's in the next swim and you're actually looking at your swim, there is no problem. But you must not leave your rods, because a fish can take you into snag straight away, and a lost fish is a wasted chance. So always sit on your rods, watch the water and beware of the signs that the fish are giving you. A fish jumping out of the water may indicate that it's a feeding fish, and it's a sign that you won't see if you're sat in your mate's bivvy watching TV, reading Carp World or drinking a cup of coffee. So always be observant of the water. And that concludes part 2 of Practical Carping. I hope you've enjoyed the videos. I've certainly enjoyed making them. Now the videos themselves just cover the basics, and obviously there are thousands more words you can read about them, and I'm sure that can bring you right up to date on the modern rigs and the modern baits. But I do assure you that carp fishing isn't hard work. As long as you're prepared to work at your fishing, if you think about your baits, you think about your rigs, and you think about what you're doing, then you can certainly catch carp. The good thing about carp fishing is that no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how poor you are, as long as you're prepared to work at your fishing, you can succeed. And I certainly hope that you do. Good luck.